Well, as we have seen, the party leaders are spending a lot of time in the province of Quebec. The Conservative leader, Andrew Scheer, is there again today, and Conservatives focusing in particular on the region around Quebec City, and CPAC's Marc-André Cossette has been profiling some of the key riding races in the province of Quebec, and he's with me now. Marc-André, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Peter.
Okay, let's start with these, and we've talked about Andrew Scheer being in Quebec, these two ridings around Quebec City, Louis-Hébert in Quebec. What do we need to know about the Quebec City area in this battle in this election?
Well, certainly these two ridings were actually Liberal gains in 2015, so that's the reason why we're keeping an eye on them right now. We want to see what will happen this time around. What we're looking at with these two ridings is essentially an island of Liberal red in a sea of Conservative blue. So these are the only two seats held by the Liberals in the Quebec City region. So they do have some fairly high-profile incumbents, of course, in Jean-Yves Duclos, who is the current Minister of Families and Social Development, and Joe Lightbound, who's currently serving as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance. And this hasn't gone unnoticed. In a campaign period, they've been really releasing a slew of announcements in the region, whether that's announcing $1.2 billion for a new tram line here in Quebec City, whether it's appointing a new negotiator to negotiate buying back the Quebec City Bridge, which is a thorny local issue here, new funds to fight homelessness. So there's been all these announcements, which is basically, trying to send the message that Liberals care about this region. They're investing in this region, and they're trying to deliver for the region. So it'll be no surprise, of course, that the Conservatives are saying quite the opposite, that the Liberals have not done nearly enough to really support the Quebec City region. And so they've been putting, as you say, a lot of efforts into these ridings to try to win them back. They have some very good candidates. We can speak about them in more detail if you like.
Sure. Tell me about who these candidates are for the Conservatives.
Sure. So if we start with Louis-Hébert, they have Marie-Josée Guérette, actually, and she's a former provincial deputy minister. She was also involved in philanthropy with a well-known financial group here, so she has a ton of connections in the city, and she's really seen as a good get for the Conservatives. She's basically campaigning on sounder fiscal management. She's saying she's hearing from lots of voters who are worried about the deficits that the Liberals have accumulated, and she wants to be able to bring that fiscal house in order so that they can better support the programs that Canadians expect to receive. On the Quebec City side, their candidate is Bianca Boutin. She's a former or ex-press attaché to a Liberal provincial minister here in Quebec. Young mother of two. She's been going at campaigning for quite some time now. She's said that she's knocked on 15,000 doors. And the message from her is quite similar as well. We need to bring our fiscal our house in order so that we can better pay for the programs that Canadians expect us to do. And really trying to say that we will be the voice of Quebecers in Ottawa, and that the Liberals have not done that adequately so far.
What in these two ridings, what if any role is the whole conversation around Bill 21 playing Quebec's law around religious symbols?
It's certainly there. It's one issue that, of course, with the Bloc Québécois, all the other parties are trying to position themselves via them, but also vis-a-vis Premier Ministre Legault, who is very popular in the province. We know that Bill 21 is, there's a consensus around it among the population in Quebec, or at least a very strong portion of Quebecers that do support it. And Prime Minister Legault is himself very popular. So what we're seeing is effectively all the different parties are trying to tiptoe around his, that line. We've seen most parties say that they will not intervene, that they will respect Quebec's autonomy, as Premier Ministre Legault had asked the day that the elections were called. The one party who's making an exception to that is, of course, the Liberals, who are saying that any responsible government must see how this plays out in the courts. They're not saying, they're saying we're not going to get involved for now, but we have to see how this plays out in the courts. So they're not shutting the door on it completely.
Okay,
so it certainly is an issue, and people that people on the street that I talk to say that's what they expect. This is a decision to be taken by Quebecers for Quebecers, and most people seem to think that the federal government should stay out of it.
Okay, so give me a sense of what the kind of campaign it's been. Do we have any indication of where the race is in terms of polling information or so on? Is it a conservative liberal race? Is it
mainly?
What role is the Bloc playing? I mean, how diverse is this race there?
Right. So we were expecting a two-way race between the Liberals and the Conservatives, and early on, it seemed like these would be, if not safe seats for the Liberals, at least leaning towards that way. The fact that the Conservatives have named some pretty strong candidates, especially in Hubert, certainly makes that race more interesting. The bigger factor that we're seeing emerge now, and we've had more news on this today, is the Bloc Québécois. There had been talk for some time that voters might go to the Bloc as this kind of third option if the other two parties aren't as popular. Why not cast your ballot for a party that whose sole mandate is to represent the interests of your province in Ottawa? And we've seen today a new poll out by Léger and the Journal de Montréal showing that the Bloc Québécois is first among voting intentions among francophones of the province. So obviously the Quebec City region is its own thing. It's not quite like the rest of the province, but that's certainly injecting a new dynamic in the race, and that the Bloc is on the rise and is making that two-way race a bit less of a tight two-way race and opening it up some more.
Right, and so it's certainly on the national scene, paying such close attention to the province of Quebec for a number of reasons, and not just the Quebec City area, but for the Conservatives, that's a big area if they want to try and find a path to victory nationally, and we're watching what happens to NDP seats there, and of course the Liberals, if they're going to lose seats in other parts of the country, they need to win seats in the province of Quebec. So very, very important races to watch there, right?
Absolutely. We know that the Conservatives with Alain Reyes, their Quebec lieutenant, has put forward, has made a lot of efforts across the province, you're right, not just in the Quebec City region, to try to attract these candidates with notoriety who can go and get those votes. We recently profiled Trois-Rivières and the fact that the Conservatives were able to recruit their former mayor, so that's just one example. Here again in Quebec City, we're not quite sure whether we have that same level of notoriety, but Marie-Josée Guérette certainly is well known, has a ton of connections across the city. The fact that Andrew Scheer is coming today to lend his support to her is again a sign of just how badly the Conservatives want to make some gains in Quebec, and as you say, how key that is to any path of victory for them and for any other at the government.
All right, CPAC's Marc-André Cossette on the campaign trail, ridings to watch in Quebec. As always, thanks, Marc-André.
My pleasure. Thank you.
There's also a lot of attention in battleground Atlantic Canada, where in the last election the Liberals won 32 seats, but few people expect them to repeat that this time. And one of the places we're watching closely, of course, we're in all of Atlantic Canada in our ridings to watch, but we are going to spend some time talking about Nova Scotia right now, and CPAC's Martin Stringer has been on the ground there for us. Martin, give me a sense overall of why Nova Scotia is so important.
Well, Peter, as you know, in Atlantic Canada, the Liberals took all of the seats in Atlantic Canada, and here in Nova Scotia, they took them all. There are a number of ridings in which the tradition is far from Liberal. In fact, we were in two ridings where no Liberal has ever been re-elected a second time. In Cumberland-Colchester, for example, where Bill Casey has just retired, well, that riding has never had a Liberal win a seat more than once. So that is a riding that's very, very open for an open contest. And there we have an NDP provincial politician who has come over to run for the Liberals, and we have an incumbent, a Conservative, who used to be the MP for 4 years, and he's trying to win that seat back for the Conservatives. Another riding, which is equally interesting and has an equally solid Conservative tradition of no Liberals ever winning a second seat, is Central Nova. And that's a riding people would know because of the history of Elmer MacKay and Brian Mulroney briefly, and Peter MacKay having held that riding for more than 40 years. In that riding, the incumbent, Sean Fraser, is in a very, very tight contest against a country western star, George Canyon, who's running for the Conservatives. He's hoping to win that riding back. And I'll just mention one other very, very tight riding that nobody seems to be able to predict, and that is what's called South Shore St. Margaret's. It's a huge riding leading all the way from Halifax down to the South Shore around Yarmouth. And there, Bernadette Jordan, who is the Minister of Rural Development, a Liberal, is also wondering whether she will be able to retain that seat.
Okay, now you've made your way to Cape Breton, and that's been sort of solid Liberal ground because of a couple of high-profile candidates or MPs in the past, one in particular, but he's not running again. So, tell me what we need to know about that battle for Cape Breton.
Okay. Well, Peter, as you mentioned, two Liberals, both retired, both had sat for 19 years as the MPs from Cape Breton, Mark Eiking and Roger Cuzner. But you're referring, of course, to Roger Cuzner, who was very well known and very popular. After retiring 19 years later, this is a riding that many people say shouldn't really be much of a question mark because Roger Cuzner won it 6 times and won it with 74% of the vote. Well, now that he's gone, a lot of the commentators are saying, really, this riding is quite open for the picking. And the Conservative who has the person who got the Conservative nomination is definitely someone who is going to make this race very interesting. His name is Alfie MacLeod, and Alfie MacLeod ran against Roger Cuzner back in 2000 when Mr. Cuzner started his liberal reign. Alfie MacLeod stepped down as an MLA in the Nova Scotia legislature, and Andrew Scheer was very glad to have him as a star candidate. He's very well known in this riding. He's occupied a number of jobs in addition to MLA, and he is a person they are counting on greatly. And the people who, well, the person they're counting on to hopefully hold the riding is a very successful and very well-respected businessman, Mike Kellaway. But it's quite an interesting riding because people are now saying it's quite up for grabs. It's also like a lot of the ridings in Nova Scotia and around Atlantic Canada in the sense that there's a real question as to who constitutes the third party or the third place contender. Because here in Cape Breton, there is a name that many people in Ottawa would be familiar with, Clive Doucette, former mayoralty candidate in Ottawa, a long-time municipal councillor. He's retired to Cape Breton. His family goes back 2 generations here, and he's running for the Greens, and he's a very, very notable presence, as well as the NDP. So there's a big question, too, about that. As you'll see in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and PI, big question about who really does have that third-party status or standing in terms of support.
All right, let's finish on this. Is there one? There's always many issues in a campaign, but is there an overriding issue for the people of Nova Scotia?
Peter, there is overwhelmingly one issue, and the question is, will it dictate the results in Atlantic Canada? And that is healthcare. 57,000 Nova Scotians don't have a family physician. Here in Cape Breton, Stephen McNeil just announced the closure of 2 regional hospitals. He says he's rationalizing healthcare services, but every single politician here of any stripe on the federal level is facing what is a provincial jurisdiction, but the demand is to have the federal government step in or do more to help what is really a healthcare crisis. So it's absolutely unambiguous when you talk to people here. There's barely even a mention of things like the blackface controversy down here. It is healthcare, and then, of course, it's economic development and the exodus of young people.
All right, lots to watch for the Battle of Nova Scotia as part of the Battle of Atlantic Canada. Martin Stringer, we'll catch up with you again. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome.